12 hours before the flash flood hit, the entire city was under an emergency evacuation order. My parents frantically stuffed all their valuables into the SUV and sped away. They took their adopted daughter, and they even took her 2 pet turtles. But they forgot me. As the muddy water began to pour into our street, my mother finally realized I was still at home. Lynn, you need to run. The flood is coming. Where are you guys? On the other end of the line, my mother's voice sounded guilty. Just run. Now. Then I heard Chloe's excited voice in the background. Mom, Dad, look. The highway gates are open. We can get through. In that instant, cold reality hit me. They had already abandoned me and fled. After I miraculously survived the disaster, they came back, crying and begging me to recognize them. But I walked right past them and ran into the arms of my adoptive parents. Lynn, you need to run. The flood is coming. When the landline rang, I was woken up by the sound of rushing water. My backpack was already floating on the floor, and my second-grade worksheets were soaked into mush. Mom, there's water everywhere. Where are you? I burst into tears, completely panicked, not knowing what to do. My mother didn't answer right away. Her voice trembled with guilt. Just run, okay? That was when I noticed every door in the house was wide open. My parents' room looked like it had been ransacked. Chloe's room was completely empty. Even the 2 pet turtles on the balcony were gone. A loud buzz echoed in my head, and my face turned paper white. A terrifying thought crept into my mind. No, it couldn't be. My parents wouldn't just abandon me. Mom, Dad, the water is so high. Where are you? I'm scared. Please come save me. My small, frail body curled up into the corner of the sofa. I clutched my stuffed rabbit, my voice shaking violently. My mother remained silent. Instead, Chloe's cheerful voice drifted through the receiver. Mom, Dad, look. The highway gates are open. We can get through. At that moment, my entire world collapsed. The disaster was here, and my parents had fled with my cousin. They had packed up every single piece of luggage, not forgetting Chloe's pet turtles. Yet they had somehow forgotten me. Then my father's angry, defensive voice boomed through the phone. Why are you even asking? You slept like a dead pig. Who could have woken you up? I sobbed even harder. I had been running a high fever for 2 days before my mother even noticed. She had called my school to get me sick leave, and after giving me some heavy medication, I had fallen into a deep, drug-induced sleep. My mother sounded annoyed now. Stop crying. There's still some time before the worst of the flood hits. Go downstairs right now and find some other neighbors who are evacuating. Your father and I will come back for you with Chloe later. Suddenly, the phone let out a sharp, static screech. The power went out. The water kept rising. Crying, I struggled to run upstairs. We lived in an old 3-story apartment complex. Halfway up, I remembered the inflatable swim ring Chloe used for her swimming lessons. I waded back through the dirty water, sobbing, to grab it. The water rose higher and higher, until it completely swallowed the 3rd floor. With one arm looped through the swim ring, I clung desperately to a floating wooden door. I drifted in the dark for what felt like eternity. My body grew colder and colder, until my consciousness faded into black. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on a cot in a makeshift emergency shelter hospital. In my hazy state, I felt someone feeding me medicine and gently wiping my face. A sharp sting in my hand made me let out a weak whimper, and I slowly opened my eyes. A woman in a white nurse's uniform looked down at me with a gentle smile. You're awake, sweetie. Don't move. The 4 will help you feel better soon. Why were you all alone in the water? Where is your family? I looked down, my tears dripping onto the white sheets. I just cried and didn't say a word. The nurse looked startled, and out of pity and guilt for bringing up a painful topic, she quickly changed the subject. Are you hungry? Do you want some chicken tenders? I'll get you some. I looked at her and nodded timidly. Because of the prolonged high fever, my throat was severely damaged. Whenever anyone asked about my family, I simply shook my head. They assumed I was an orphan. Everyone in the shelter looked at me with pity, whispering about sending me to a foster home. But I gripped the nurse's uniform tightly. Wherever she went, I followed. I was terrified of being abandoned again. Her heart melted. Unable to leave me, she took me home. When she opened her door, a little boy gasped in excitement. Mom, Dad, did you really bring me a big sister? He circled me, looking at me with pure curiosity. I stood there, awkwardly pinching the hem of my shirt. Helen, the nurse, laughed softly. Peter has been begging for a sister every single day. Helen's husband, Arthur, worked for the local government. He was a kind, gentle man. After looking at me, he and Helen exchanged a long glance and went into the bedroom to talk for a long time. Later, Helen knelt in front of me, her voice incredibly sweet. Would you like to stay with us, sweetie? Can I be your mom? I looked at her, overwhelmed. My vision blurred as warm tears spilled over my hands. Mom, I whispered. Ellen gasped in pure joy. Oh my God, you can talk. Later, they went through the legal adoption process. Arthur changed my last name to Miller, and they named me Brooke. because Helen said she had rescued me from the water. 3 years later, it was the start of the school year in September. Peter was entering the 1st grade, and I was in the 5th. I confidently led my parents through the crowded hallways to find Peter's new classroom. Mom, Dad, that's Mrs. Davis. She was my English teacher, and now she's going to be Peter's homeroom teacher. Just as I was about to walk over to greet Mrs. Davis, a shockingly familiar voice rang out. Lynn. Is that you, Lynn? The next second, a woman grabbed my arm with brute force. It was my biological mother, Sarah. Behind her stood Chloe. Right, Chloe would be starting 1st grade this year too. Sarah stared at me in shock and frantic joy. Once she recognized my face, a heartbreaking sob escaped her throat. Lynn. My baby girl. I thought you were dead. Why didn't you come find us? Where have you been? She held me in a suffocating grip, crying hysterically. Lynn, I missed you so much. Why aren't you calling me Mom? I looked at her with utter confusion. Ma'am, I think you have the wrong person. Under her stunned gaze, I pulled my arm free, ran over to Helen and Arthur, and hid behind them, pretending to be terrified. Sarah looked heartbroken. How can you not recognize your own mother? Lynn, look at me. I'm your mom. We got separated in the flood 3 years ago. I furrowed my brows, looking at her with cold, distant eyes. You really have the wrong person, ma'am. My parents are right here. Sarah froze. She stared at our family of 4, shaking her head in agony. No. She couldn't understand how her perfect daughter had suddenly become someone else's child. And why was I calling another woman Mom? The surrounding parents and students were startled by her hysterical behavior. Helen and Arthur exchanged a look, instantly realizing who this woman was. Helen looked down at me. I gave her a tiny, subtle shake of my head. Although Helen didn't understand why I was denying them, she immediately stepped in front of me to shield me. Excuse me, ma'am, but you have indeed mistaken her. This is my daughter, Brooke Miller. She is not the Lynn you are looking for. Just then my biological father, Mark, arrived and overheard the exchange. The hope in his eyes instantly died, and he muttered in a daze. Brooke? But she looks exactly like Lynn. Mrs. Davis stepped in to defuse the situation. Chloe's mom, you must be mistaken. Brooke has been my student for a while now. Seeing everyone staring, Chloe felt embarrassed and tugged at Sarah's sleeve. Mom, stop it. Get up from the floor. Everyone assumed it was just a tragic mistake. A grieving mother who had lost a child and was seeing things. Some even offered words of comfort. But just as I let out a sigh of relief, Sarah suddenly lunged forward. She grabbed my shirt and tried to pull it up. Lynn has a red birthmark on her stomach. Let me see. I screamed in terror. Helen and Arthur immediately shoved her away. Are you insane? Trying to strip a little girl in public? If you don't back off, we are calling the police. Arthur roared. The hallway fell into absolute chaos. Until Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs. I saw it. She has the birthmark. She is Lynn. At that moment, my heart sank to the bottom of my chest. She had seen it. An hour later, both families were gathered at the local police station. In front of the officers, Mark and Sarah were furious, pointing at Helen and Arthur and screaming. They are kidnappers. Monsters. They abducted our daughter and changed her identity. They deserve to rot in prison. Helen and Arthur looked pale, but out of respect for me, they kept their composure and didn't argue back. I watched my biological parents throw their tantrum. My face was completely blank. I felt absolutely nothing for them. Officer Carter slammed his hand on the desk. Enough. This is a police station, not a circus. Keep quiet or I'll have you thrown in a holding cell. They finally shut their mouths, though they kept glaring at us. Officer Carter turned to me, his voice softening. Sweetheart, who are your real parents? Under the desperate, hopeful stares of Mark and Sarah, I clung tightly to Helen's arm. I don't know them. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Lynn, think about it. I'm your mommy. Mark barked at the officer. Officer Carter, she must have suffered some severe trauma. She lost her memory. You need to investigate these 2 kidnappers. Arthur frowned. Listen, I understand the pain of losing a child. But please calm down and stop terrifying my daughter. You claim Brooke is the child you lost. Tell me, how exactly did you lose her? Mark and Sarah suddenly froze. Sarah's eyes darted around guiltily, and Mark began to stammer. We got separated during the evacuation of the flood. A cold, mocking smile crept onto my lips. How clumsy of you. Sarah's face went pale. To cover her guilt, she wailed dramatically. Oh, sweetie, you don't understand how evil people can be. If it weren't for these sick kidnappers, you would have never been lost. They must have drugged you to make you forget us. Aren't you afraid of God's wrath, you monsters? Sarah cried as if she were the star of a tragic movie about a mother searching for her lost child. Yet, she didn't mention a single word about leaving me behind in the rising flood. Mark pointed a finger threateningly at Helen and Arthur. You child thieves. I bet that boy of yours was bought on the black market too. Officer Carter, these kidnappers need to be locked away forever. Arthur's face turned red with anger, and Helen shook with rage. Watch your mouth in front of the kids. I stepped in front of my adoptive parents. Whatever garbage comes out of your mouth just bounces off us and sticks back onto you. Mark and Sarah's faces twisted in shock, unable to believe I had spoken to them that way. Officer Carter rubbed his temples. Look, is this child biologically yours? If you have her birth certificate, show it to us. Otherwise, we'll have to do a DNA test. Helen and Arthur exchanged a worried look. Just as they were about to speak, I cut them off. Why should I have to take a DNA test with strangers? If they want to prove something, they should be the ones bringing the evidence. Don't I know who my own parents are? I didn't want to go back to them. Not even a little bit. Officer Carter blinked, surprised by my sharp logic. She has a point. Do you have any proof? The atmosphere in the precinct's small consultation room grew suffocating. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like an angry insect. Mark reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his leather wallet, and slapped a faded, laminated paper onto the officer's desk. Here, Mark barked, his face red and blotchy. Her birth certificate. Lynn Vance, born June 14th. Mother, Sarah Vance. Father, Mark Vance. Look at the registration city. Look at the date. It matches her age perfectly. Officer Carter picked up the paper, examining it under the desk lamp. He checked his computer terminal, typing in the social security number listed on the document. The birth record is real, Officer Carter noted, looking up over his spectac. It shows a Lynn Vance born to you 11 years ago. Sarah instantly let out a high-pitched, triumphant cry. She lunged toward me, her arms outstretched, her voice cracking with hysterical joy. I told you she's my baby. Come to Mommy Lynn. We're taking you home right now. I didn't move an inch. I didn't flinch or cringe. I simply leaned my shoulder firmly against Helen's arm, my hands tucked inside the pockets of my clean yellow cardigan. Officer Carter. Arthur spoke up, his deep, resonant voice cutting through Sarah's shrieks. His posture was completely composed, the natural poise of a senior municipal administrator who understood the machinery of the law far better than Mark or Sarah ever could. Yes, Mr. Miller? Officer Carter asked. My wife and I do not dispute that a child named Lynn Vance was born to these individuals 11 years ago, Arthur said, resting his hand on my shoulder. What we dispute is their claim of kidnapping, and more importantly their narrative of how they lost her. Arthur leaned forward, tapping his finger on the desk. If a child is lost in a catastrophic natural disaster, Arthur continued smoothly, the standard legal procedure requires the legal guardians to file an official missing persons report with the Emergency Management Bureau or the local precinct within 48 hours to facilitate search and rescue efforts. That is a prerequisite for any insurance claim, disaster relief aid, or child recovery registry. Arthur looked directly into Officer Carter's eyes. Detective, please cross-reference the state missing children database from the year of the Great River Flood. Check if Mark or Sarah Vance ever filed a report for Lynn Vance. The room went dead silent. Sarah's triumphant smile froze. Her hands, still hovering in the air toward me, slowly dropped. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the corner of the room, where Chloe was standing, chewing on her thumbnail. Officer Carter's eyes narrowed. He turned to his keyboard, his fingers clacking rapidly against the keys. The screen glowed blue against his face as he scrolled through the archived state records from 3 years ago. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. The clacking stopped. Officer Carter looked up from the monitor. His expression was no longer neutral. It had turned into something dark, sharp, and deeply suspicious. There is no record, Officer Carter said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat register. No missing persons report. No inquiry filed with the Red Cross. No entry in the casualty or displacement registry under the name Lynn Vance. Sarah stammered, her hands trembling violently as she grabbed Mark's sleeve. The phone lines were down. The roads were blocked. We couldn't get through to the precinct. The Flood Response Center remained operational for 6 months after the waters receded, Mrs. Vance, Officer Carter said, leaning over his desk, his eyes locked onto her. Every displaced family in the county registered their missing kin to receive emergency housing vouchers. You registered for 3 occupants. Mark Vance, Sarah Vance, and Chloe Vance. You claimed a 3-person household. Mark's face went from red to an unsightly, sallow gray. You didn't lose a child in the flood, Mr. Vance, Officer Carter whispered, the realization dawning on him with sickening clarity. You never looked for her. My biological parents stood frozen in the middle of the police station, exposed by the very database they thought would save them. Chloe, sensing the shift in the room, shrank back against the wall. Mom. Dad. What is the officer talking about? Didn't you say Lynn ran away? Shut up, Chloe. Mark hissed through his teeth, his composure completely shattering. Sarah began to weep. Not the theatrical, tragic mother cry she had put on earlier, but frantic, terrified sobs of a woman caught in a corner. She threw herself onto her knees in front of Officer Carter's desk. "You don't understand," Sarah wailed, clutching at the edge of the wood. It was chaos. The water was coming up the street. We had 5 minutes to leave. We thought she was right behind us. When we got to the highway, we realized she wasn't in the car, but the National Guard wouldn't let us turn back. It was a tragedy. A terrible, tragic mistake. I let out a soft, quiet laugh. It wasn't a bitter scream or an angry yell. It was a light, hollow sound that made everyone in the room turn to look at me. "A mistake?" I asked, looking down at Sarah as she knelt on the floor. "You had time to pack 3 suitcases of winter clothes. You had time to grab the gold jewelry from your vanity drawer. You had time to load Chloe's bicycle into the trunk." I took a step forward, pulling my hands out of my cardigan pockets. "And you had time to go out onto the balcony, grab the plastic tank with Chloe's 2 yellow-eared slider turtles, and strap it securely into the back seat so they wouldn't get bumped during the drive." The precinct fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the rain tapping against the high windows outside. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes bulged in terror as she stared up at me. You remember?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I remember everything, Sarah," I said, using her first name without a shred of warmth or hesitation. "I remember the high fever I had for 2 days before the storm. I remember the heavy sleep medicine you gave me so I wouldn't cry and disrupt Chloe's afternoon nap." I looked at Mark, whose jaw was quivering uncontrollably. "And I remember the landline phone ringing at 6 in the morning," I continued, my voice steady, clear, and ringing through the station like a bell. "I remember calling for you from the sofa, watching the brown water rise over my ankles. And I remember Dad's voice coming through the speaker." I looked Mark dead in the eyes, repeating the exact words he had spat at an 8-year-old child 3 years ago. "Why are you even asking? You slept like a dead pig. Who could have woken you up?" Helen covered her mouth, a choked gasp escaping her throat as tears flooded her eyes. She pulled me fiercely against her side, her body shaking with protective rage. Arthur's face turned white with absolute fury. He took a heavy step toward Mark. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Officer Carter stood up slowly from his chair. His hand rested heavily on his utility belt as he stared at Mark and Sarah. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," Officer Carter said, his voice icy enough to freeze water, "I am placing a hold on this matter. You are not taking this child anywhere tonight. In fact, you are going to sit right here while I contact the State Department of Children and Family Services and the State Prosecutor's Homicide and Child Abuse Unit." "No," Mark screamed, backing toward the exit. "This is an outrage. She's our biological daughter. You can't keep her from us based on the lies of an ungrateful brat. Try stepping through that door, Mr. Vance," Officer Carter warned, gesturing to 2 uniformed officers standing near the foyer, "and I'll have you in handcuffs for felony child endangerment before your foot hits the sidewalk." The State Child Welfare Office moved with terrifying speed once an administrator of Arthur's rank and an officer of Carter's tenure pushed the paperwork through. By noon the following day, an emergency protective order was issued by the family court, granting temporary wardship of Brooke Miller to Helen and Arthur, while freezing any custody petitions from Mark and Sarah Vance pending a formal criminal investigation. However, the legal hurdle remained. To formally charge Mark and Sarah with criminal abandonment and defend the validity of my adoption, the court required an absolute, indisputable biological match to establish their legal duty of care at the time of the flood. A mandatory court-ordered DNA extraction was scheduled for Friday morning at the Municipal Forensic Center. I sat on the paper-lined examination table in the clinic room, holding a paper cup of warm apple juice. Helen sat beside me, gently stroking my hair. "Are you scared, sweetie?" Helen asked softly. I shook my head. "No, Mom. I'm not scared." "You don't have to look at them when they come in," Arthur said from the doorway, holding a stack of legal briefs provided by our family attorney. "The technicians will draw their samples in a separate room." "I don't care if I see them," I said, taking a sip of the juice. "They don't have power over me anymore." Just then the door opened, and a forensic technician walked in carrying a tray of sterile cotton swabs and glass vials. Behind her came Officer Carter, accompanied by a sharp-looking woman in a charcoal business suit, District Attorney Victoria Sterling. "Brooke," DA Sterling said, offering a warm, professional smile as she pulled up a chair. "I've reviewed the audio logs and the statements provided by your school and the emergency shelter from 3 years ago. Your memory of the event is remarkably sharp. I had a fever, but I wasn't stupid, I said simply. DA Sterling nodded, her expression turning grave. We ran a background check on Mark Vance's financial records from the year of the flood. Do you know what we found? Helen and Arthur leaned in, listening intently. 2 weeks after the floodwaters cleared, DA Sterling explained, opening a thick blue folder. Mark Vance applied for a state disaster reconstruction grant for his property. On the application, he listed his daughter, Lynn Vance, as deceased due to flood casualty in order to claim the maximum death benefit payout of $50,000. Helen gasped, her hand clutching her chest. They claimed the money for her death. They didn't just claim it, DA Sterling said, her eyes flashing with cold disgust. They used that $50,000 as the down payment for the new house in the suburbs, the one where they currently live with Chloe. My hands tightened around my juice cup. They hadn't just abandoned me to drown. They had monetized my death. They had turned my drowned body into a down payment for Chloe's new life. They used my death to buy her a house. I murmured, a cold, dark realization settling deep inside my soul. Yes, DA Sterling said softly. Which is why this is no longer just a case of child abandonment. It is first-degree fraud, grand larceny against the state, and reckless endangerment resulting in presumed fatality. She looked at the technician who was preparing the cheek swabs. Once this DNA test confirms you are Lynn Vance, DA Sterling declared, we aren't just protecting your adoption, Brooke. We are sending Mark and Sarah Vance to a state penitentiary. The DNA results came back 48 hours later. Maternal probability, 99.998% Sarah Vance. Paternity probability, 997% Mark Vance. The paper was delivered directly to the family court judge, Honorable Richard Myers, during an emergency closed-door hearing on Monday afternoon. Mark and Sarah sat on the left side of the courtroom with their court-appointed defense attorney, a tired-looking man who looked as though he wished he were anywhere else in the world. They had spent their weekend savings hiring a private publicist to try to spin the story online, but the local news had already caught wind of the disaster benefit fraud angle. Chloe sat in the front row of the spectator gallery behind them, looking miserable and out of place. Her classmates at school had already seen the news reports, and the former popular girl was now being shunned by everyone. Arthur, Helen, and I sat on the right side of the courtroom alongside DA Sterling. Judge Myers adjusted his glasses, reading through the DNA report and the attached state fraud indictment. The biological lineage is established beyond doubt, Judge Myers announced, his voice echoing off the high wood-paneled walls. The minor child known as Brooke Miller is biologically Lynn Vance. Sarah instantly let out a loud sob, reaching across the wooden divider toward me. Lynn, my baby. The judge said it. You are my daughter. Tell them you want to come home with mommy. Silence in the court. Judge Myers slammed his wooden gavel down with a deafening thud. Sarah shrank back, weeping into her tissue. However, Judge Myers continued, his sharp eyes glaring over his spectacles at Mark and Sarah. The court is also in receipt of a criminal indictment filed by the state attorney's office, charging Mr. and Mrs. Vance with 2 counts of felony fraud, 1 count of child abandonment, and 1 count of wire fraud. Mark's defense attorney stood up hastily. Your Honor, my clients maintain that the disaster benefit application was a result of administrative confusion during a state of emergency. They genuinely believed their child had perished in the rising waters. Administrative confusion? DA Sterling stood up calmly, smoothing her suit jacket. Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to play State's Exhibit C, an audio recording recovered yesterday from the archived digital backup of the county landline switching station. Mark's attorney frowned. An audio recording? From 3 years ago. On the morning of the disaster, DA Sterling explained, all landline communications within the flood zone were recorded by the automated emergency routing system to assist post-disaster search efforts. We retrieved the incoming call made to the Vance household landline at 6:14 a.m. on August 12. DA Sterling pressed a button on her laptop. A sharp, static crackle filled the silent courtroom. Then a child's trembling, small voice echoed through the high-grade court speakers. Mom, there's water everywhere. Where are you? Followed by Sarah's guilty, panicked voice. Just run, okay? And then, crystal clear, carrying over the hum of the static, came Chloe's cheerful 8-year-old voice from the background. Mom, Dad, look. The highway gates are open. We can get through. And finally, Mark's furious, booming roar. Why are you even asking? You slept like a dead pig. Who could have woken you up? Click. The audio ended. The courtroom fell into an absolute, suffocating dead silence. Judge Myers lowered his papers. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. He just stared down from the high bench at Mark and Sarah Vance. His eyes were filled with an absolute, terrifying disdain. Sarah sat frozen in her wooden chair, her skin translucent white, her hands trembling so hard she dropped her tissue onto the floorboards. Mark looked down at his lap, his shoulders slouched, unable to lift his head under the weight of his own recorded voice. Even their defense attorney slowly sat down, closing his briefcase, refusing to utter another word of defense. In the spectator row behind them, 10-year-old Chloe stared at her parents in absolute horror. You left her on purpose? Chloe whispered, her voice carrying through the quiet room. You told me she was at Grandma's house. Chloe, shut up. Mark rasped, his voice breaking. You lied to me. Chloe sobbed, burying her face in her hands, realizing that her entire life of privilege, her clothes, her private swimming lessons, her new house, had been bought with the money from her cousin's abandoned corpse. Judge Myers picked up his pen, signing 3 separate documents on his desk with sharp, decisive strokes. In the matter of the biological parents, Mark and Sarah Vance, Judge Myers declared, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority, this court finds clear, overwhelming evidence of severe criminal negligence, willful abandonment, and systemic fraud. He looked at DA Sterling. The criminal trial for felony abandonment and state fraud is remanded to the Superior Criminal Court. Bail is set at $200,000 each. Bailiffs, take the defendants into custody. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped forward, pulling steel handcuffs from their utility belts. Click, click. The cold iron snapped around Mark and Sarah's wrists right there in front of the judge's bench. Lynn, Lynn. Sarah shrieked hysterically as the deputies pulled her up from her chair, her heels dragging against the carpet. Tell them to stop. I'm your mother. I gave birth to you. You can't let them take me to jail. Lynn. Mark thrashed against the deputy's grip, his face contorted in frantic rage. You ungrateful little monster. We raised you for 8 years. You ruined our lives. You destroyed this family. I stood beside Helen and Arthur. I watched the 2 people who had brought me into this world get dragged toward the side, holding cell door, screaming and weeping into the empty air. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel joy. I felt only a quiet, beautiful peace. Judge Myers turned his gaze onto our side of the courtroom. His harsh expression softened completely, replaced by a warm, paternal kindness. Regarding the civil petition for legal adoption, Judge Myers said softly, reading from the final document, all biological parental rights of Mark and Sarah Vance over the child formerly known as Lynn Vance are hereby permanently terminated under State Code 402. He looked straight at me, offering a gentle smile. The adoption of Brooke Miller by Helen and Arthur Miller is hereby reconfirmed, finalized, and sealed under state law forever. You are a Miller, Brooke. Legally, officially, and permanently. He slammed his gavel down one last time. Thud. Court is adjourned. The criminal trial took place 4 months later. Without the money to hire a private defense lawyer, since the state had frozen their bank accounts and placed a lien on their suburban home to recover the $50,000 in stolen disaster funds, Mark and Sarah were represented by an overworked public defender. The trial lasted only 3 days. The combination of the archived telephone logs, the forged disaster relief applications, and the testimony from the emergency shelter staff made a defense completely impossible. The jury deliberated for less than 45 minutes. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Mark Vance was sentenced to 7 years at the state maximum security penitentiary for felony fraud and reckless child endangerment. Sarah Vance was sentenced to 5 years at the state women's correctional facility for grand larceny and criminal child abandonment. Their suburban house was auctioned off by the county sheriff to satisfy the restitution order owed to the state. The remaining funds were placed into a court-monitored educational trust fund under my name, money that Arthur promptly instructed the bank to freeze until I turned 21. As for Chloe, with both of her adoptive parents in prison and her family home auctioned off, she was placed under the care of the State Department of Human Services. Since no other relatives were willing to take on the financial burden of raising her, she was sent to a state-run group home 2 hours outside the city. The spoiled girl who had complained about her pet turtles and demanded new sports gear was now wearing donated clothes from community drives, eating cafeteria meals, and attending a public middle school where nobody knew or cared about her former status. I never visited her. I never looked her up. She was a ghost from a past life that had dissolved into the floodwaters. 7 years later, the afternoon sun broke through the oak trees surrounding the Quadet State University, casting golden light across hundreds of graduating students in navy blue gowns. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, blooming jasmine, and warm summer air. And now, the dean's voice boomed over the stadium loudspeakers, the recipient of this year's University Chancellor Gold Medal for Excellence in Biomedical, Brooke Miller. Thunderous applause erupted across the bleachers. I stood up from my seat in the front row, adjusting my yellow honor sash, and walked up the wooden stairs to the central stage. In the third row of the family VIP section, 3 people were standing clapping frantically. Helen, wearing an elegant cream dress, wiping tears of pure pride from her cheeks with a tissue. Arthur, wearing his formal suit, waving his program in the air, smiling brightly. And 12-year-old Peter, standing on his chair, screaming at the top of his lungs. "That's my big sister. That's Brooke." I smiled, bowed politely to the faculty panel, and accepted the heavy gold medal and leather-bound diploma from the chancellor. "Congratulations, Miss Miller," the chancellor said warmly, shaking my hand. "Your research on pediatric trauma recovery is groundbreaking. The state is lucky to have you." "Thank you, sir," I said softly. As I walked back down the stage steps holding my diploma, my eyes briefly drifted toward the outer iron fence surrounding the stadium perimeter. Standing outside the security gates, clutching the rusty iron bars, was a woman. She was thin, prematurely aged, wearing a faded gray coat and worn-down sneakers. Her hair was streaked with dull gray, her skin weathered by years of hard labor following her early release on parole. It was Sarah. Beside her stood a man with slouched shoulders and a hollowed-out face, Mark, who had been released 6 months prior, now working night shifts as a janitor at a local bus station. They stood outside the gates in the hot sun, watching the brilliant, radiant girl in the navy gown standing under the spotlights, surrounded by high society, professors, university donors, and loving family. Sarah's lips moved through the iron bars, forming a silent, desperate word that carried no sound across the crowded field. "Lynn." She reached out a thin, calloused hand through the bars, weeping quietly, watching the daughter she had abandoned to drown now standing at the apex of the world. I looked at her for 2 seconds. My pulse didn't change. My step didn't falter. There was no hatred in my heart, no lingering pain, no desire for revenge. To me, she was simply a stranger standing on the other side of a fence, a distant, insignificant shadow under the bright summer sun. I turned my back on the gates. I ran down the sunlit grassy hill toward the 3 people waiting for me with open arms, throwing myself into Helen's warm, tight hug as Peter laughed and grabbed my diploma. "We are so proud of you, Brooke," Arthur said, his eyes shining as he wrapped his arms around all of us. "I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad," I whispered, leaning my head against Helen's shoulder, taking a deep, clean breath of the fresh morning air. The floodwaters had taken my past, but love had given me my life, and my world was bright, clear, and completely, gloriously mine.